German radar could see everything, every single bomber, tracked, every route, predicted, night after night. Royal Air Force crews were being slaughtered, hunted in the pitch-black dark, until one specific night in 1943, the glowing green screens went blank, and the mighty German night fighters were flying blind. They dropped something into the sky, and nothing worked anymore. This is the story of the night the hunters became the prey. The night sky used to be a sanctuary, a dark shield for the British heavy bombers crossing the English Channel. But the Third Reich had built a massive, invisible wall, the Kammhuber Line, a sprawling network of listening posts and advanced radar stations stretching across the entire coast of occupied Europe. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, and it was a death sentence for the young boys flying the Lancasters. The crews taking off from the rural air bases knew the bitter truth. The darkness could no longer hide them. As soon as they breached the European coastline, invisible electronic pulses bounced off their metal wings. Down in the fortified concrete bunkers, German operators watched their approach with chilling precision. They knew the altitude. They knew the speed. They knew exactly where the bombers were going. The mechanics of this slaughter were terrifying. Ground controllers guided the lethal Messerschmitt and Junkers night fighters right into the bomber stream. The British pilots could not see the enemy until it was too late. Tracers lit up the freezing air. Bombers erupted into falling fireballs. The survival rate was plummeting. The heavy bomber offensive was bleeding out in the cold skies over Germany. The air war was being lost on glowing green screens. Something had to change. The casualty figures arriving at the Air Ministry in London were unbearable. Sending young men into an inescapable electronic trap was unsustainable. The German radar network was too vast to destroy with conventional bombs. It was too entrenched to bypass. The British needed a miracle. They needed a way to break the eyes of the enemy without firing a single shot. Scientists worked frantically behind closed doors. They analyzed intercepted signals. They studied the specific frequencies of the German Würzburg radar systems. The solution they discovered was almost insulting in its simplicity. But it was considered so dangerous, so double-edged, that the High Command refused to use it for over a year. It sat locked in the vaults, a secret that could win the air war. Gathering dust. The fear was paralyzing. If the British used this secret weapon, the Germans would instantly understand how it worked. They could pick it up from the ground, copy the exact design, and use it against the defenses of England the very next week. The risk of retaliation terrified the generals. While hundreds of heavy bombers continued to fall from the sky, the blood of the crews paid the heavy price for this hesitation. But by the summer of 1943, the tipping point arrived. The massive raid on Hamburg was planned. Operation Gomorrah. The stakes were too high. The expected losses were too catastrophic. The Prime Minister finally gave the order. The secret weapon was loaded into the bomb bays. Not high explosives, not incendiaries, just bundles of a strange, lightweight material. The trap was set. The greatest deception in aerial history was about to begin. July 1943. Airfields across England roared to life. Over 700 heavy bombers prepared to launch. Operation Gomorrah was underway, but this mission carried a strange cargo. Alongside the massive high explosives, ground crews loaded plain brown paper packages. The young gunners and navigators asked questions. The briefing officers gave only strict orders. Open the bundles. Push the contents down the flare chutes. One package every single minute. Do not ask why. Just drop them into the dark. The massive Lancaster bombers climbed into the freezing night. The English Channel passed below in pitch-black silence. The crews braced for the inevitable. The dreaded Kammhuber Line was waiting. The invisible electronic pulses were already reaching out, searching the sky for British metal. The aviators gripped their controls, waiting for the blinding searchlights, waiting for the lethal flak. Deep inside occupied Europe. The German radar bunkers were fully staffed. The elite operators watched their glowing Würzburg screens. The early warning systems hummed with lethal efficiency. They tracked the incoming armada with ease. The coordinates were calculated. The commands were issued. Luftwaffe night fighters roared down the runways. The intercept grid was active. The hunters were climbing to meet their prey. High above the North Sea, the British navigators checked their synchronized watches. The target coordinates approached. The order echoed through the intercoms. The crews tore open the brown paper packages. They shoved the mysterious contents down the narrow metal chutes. The strange payload tumbled into the freezing slipstream, disappearing into the immense void behind the bomber's stream. Back in the concrete bunkers, the German radar operators leaned closer to their monitors. A strange anomaly flickered across the green glass. A few extra blips appeared around the British bomber formations. The technicians adjusted their tuning dials. They assumed it was a minor atmospheric glitch, a temporary interference. The equipment was state-of-the-art. It did not make mistakes, but the anomaly did not fade. It multiplied. The scattered blips merged into dense clusters. Dozens turned into hundreds. Hundreds mutated into tens of thousands. The pristine radar screens became a blinding snowstorm of electronic noise. The precise glowing dots representing the Lancaster bombers vanished, swallowed by a colossal, unnatural cloud of static. Panic swept through the German command centers. The ground controllers could no longer track a single real aircraft. The sky was overflowing with phantom bombers. They screamed frantic orders into their heavy microphones, trying to guide the Luftwaffe interceptors to the British fleet. But the coordinates they transmitted were useless. They were sending their elite fighters to attack empty air. Up in the freezing darkness, the German pilots flew in circles. Their onboard Liechtenstein radars were crippled. The cockpit screens were overwhelmed by false targets. The night fighters were flying through a ghost fleet. They could hear the roar of the British engines in the distance, but they could find nothing to shoot. The invincible electronic shield was shattered. The hunters were blind. Inside the concrete bunkers, the German commanders demanded answers. Their elite Würzburg radar systems were state-of-the-art, built by the greatest engineering minds of the Reich. Now, they displayed a terrifying white blur. Operators pounded their consoles. They checked every vacuum tube, every wire. Nothing was broken. The machine was working perfectly, but the sky above them was lying. The secret weapon tearing their defense grid apart was not a machine. It had no power source. It possessed no glowing tubes or complex circuits. It was not a masterpiece of electronic engineering. The weapon pouring out of the British bombers was trash. The young aviators dropping the brown packages were hurling thousands of thin strips of black paper, backed with cheap aluminum foil. The British code-named this primitive invention Window. It weighed almost nothing. It cost pennies to manufacture, and it was about to change the history of aerial combat forever. The genius of Window was not in its complexity, but in its precise dimensions. The British scientists knew the exact wavelength of the German radar: 50 centimeters. So, They cut the aluminum strips to exactly 25 centimeters, half the wavelength. That specific length turned every single piece of foil into a perfect resonant antenna. As the Lancaster bombers roared toward Hamburg, the crewmen pushed the bundles down the flare chutes. The slipstream caught the paper packages. They ripped open in the freezing air, releasing massive clouds of metallic confetti. The lightweight strips did not fall straight down. They fluttered and danced in the wind, descending at a painfully slow rate. When the invisible German radar pulses hit this descending metallic cloud, the energy bounced right back. To the glowing green screen in the bunker, a single bundle of 2,000 foil strips looked exactly like a massive four-engine heavy bomber. The return signal was identical. There was no way to tell the difference between scrap metal and a real Lancaster. The RAF did not drop just a few bundles. They dropped millions. 92 million individual strips of foil fell over Germany that night. Weighing over 40 tons, they created a colossal electronic fog bank, stretching for hundreds of miles across the dark sky. The Phantom Fleet was so massive, it broke the minds of the men tracking it. The mighty Luftwaffe was paralyzed. The most sophisticated, expensive, and lethal anti-aircraft network on the entire planet was rendered useless, defeated by strips of cheap kitchen foil. The British bombers flew right through the electronic chaos, untouched. The hunters were lost in a metallic blizzard. Down in the fortified gun pits, the German anti-aircraft crews waited for targets. The mighty flak towers stood ready to tear the night sky apart. But the targeting data arriving from the command bunkers was pure chaos. The radar-directed guns spun wildly on their heavy steel mounts. They locked onto coordinates, elevated their massive barrels, and fired blindly into the pitch-black void. Thousands of heavy artillery shells detonated in the freezing air. They hit nothing but drifting foil. The steel trap was broken. The roar of the heavy guns shook the earth. Flak operators screamed over the deafening noise, demanding visual confirmation. The searchlight crews swept their brilliant beams across the clouds, hunting for the colossal British bombers. But the massive lights illuminated empty space. The radar screens insisted the enemy was right there, right above their heads. The gunners fed belt after belt of lethal ammunition into their weapons, wasting the defense of the Reich on a metallic mirage. High above the exploding artillery, the terror shifted to the Luftwaffe. The elite night fighter pilots orbited the coast. Their ground controllers frantically barked vectors into their headsets. Turn left, climb 2,000 feet, intercept the bomber stream. The German aces pushed their throttles to the absolute limit. They hunted the glowing dots on their cockpit monitors. But when they reached the exact interception point, the sky was empty. The sophisticated Liechtenstein radar mounted on the nose of the Messerschmitts became a deadly liability. The tiny screens inside the cramped cockpits filled with a blinding white fog. The electronic snowstorm masked everything. The pilots stared into the dark, desperate for a visual silhouette. The roar of hundreds of British engines echoed through the clouds. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The hunters were circling a ghost fleet. The electronic blindness bred pure panic. Dozens of heavily armed German fighters swarmed the same false coordinates, flying at hundreds of miles per hour in pitch-black darkness. Without their radar to guide them, they became a lethal hazard to each other. Pilots jerked their control columns to avoid sudden shadows. Mid-air collisions shattered the night. Burning wreckage rained down on the German countryside. The elite defenders of the homeland were tearing themselves apart. inside the central command bunker. The master controller stared at the massive plotting table. The grand map of occupied Europe was supposed to show a neat, organized battle. Instead, it looked like an infected wound. Thousands of fake bomber icons flooded the grid. The female auxiliaries pushing the markers across the glass table could not keep up. The entire tracking system collapsed under the weight of the paper illusion. The brain of the German defense was paralyzed. Up in the freezing bomber stream, the young British boys witnessed the miracle firsthand. They watched the searchlights sweep aimlessly, miles away from their actual flight path. They saw the lethal flak bursts detonating in harmless, empty clouds. The sky, usually a meat grinder of fire and steel, was eerily calm. The Lancasters flew straight through the dreaded Kammhuber Line. The metal wings cut through the darkness untouched. The paper shield held the line. The trap was neutralized. The most dangerous airspace on the planet was disarmed by cheap kitchen foil. The colossal British armada pressed forward, leaving the bewildered Luftwaffe fighters burning fuel in the empty sky behind them. The navigators checked their maps. The bomb aimers crawled into the glass noses of the Lancasters. The great city of Hamburg lay ahead, unprotected, blinded. The true horror of the night was only just beginning. The sprawling port city of Hamburg slept in the suffocating summer heat. The colossal defense batteries surrounding the docks stood silent. Down in the bunkers, the radar screens remained choked with the metallic snowstorm. The operators screamed into their headsets, begging the night fighters for visual confirmation. But the Luftwaffe aces were miles away, chasing shadows over the North Sea. The city was stripped of its electronic shield, exposed to the dark. High above the Elbe River, the vanguard of the Royal Air Force arrived. Over 700 heavy bombers, flying in an uninterrupted stream. The Lancaster crews stared through their plexiglass canopies. They expected a wall of lethal flak. They braced for the blinding glare of master searchlights. Instead, they found an eerie, terrifying calm. The deadly Kammhuber Line was broken. The path to the target was wide open. The elite Pathfinder squadrons initiated the assault. They did not need to evade heavy fire. They took their time, calculating the exact wind speed and altitude. They opened their bomb bays and released the target indicators. Cascades of brilliant yellow and green flares plummeted toward the historic city center, igniting the pitch-black abyss, marking a pristine, undefended bullseye right over the densely populated streets. The main bomber force followed the flares. The bombardiers pressed their eyes to the bomb sites. Without the constant terror of fighter interception, their aim was chillingly precise. The mechanical bell rang in hundreds of cockpits. The heavy payload dropped into the void. Thousands of massive high-explosive blockbusters and incendiary canisters rained down on the unsuspecting city. The air raid sirens wailed too late. The doom of Hamburg was sealed. On the ground, the shock was paralyzing. The citizens of the Reich believed their radar network was invincible. They trusted the glowing green screens to give them ample warning. But the first warning they received was the deafening roar of falling steel. Buildings collapsed into mountains of rubble. Firestorms began to sprout in the medieval timber districts. The mighty anti-aircraft guns finally opened fire, but they were shooting blind into the smoke. Up in the freezing cockpits, the British pilots witnessed an impossible victory. On a standard raid of this magnitude, the Air Ministry expected catastrophic losses. Dozens of aircraft turned into falling coffins, hundreds of young men dead or captured. But tonight, the Lancaster formations remained intact. The paper shield was working a miracle. The deadly night fighters were still wandering, lost in the foil-choked sky. The numbers proved the sheer genius of the deception. Out of the massive armada sent to obliterate Hamburg, only 12 bombers were lost, a casualty rate of just 1.5%. It was an astonishing, unprecedented triumph. The simple strips of aluminum foil saved the lives of over 400 British aviators in a single night. The cheapest material in the bomber command arsenal became its most valuable armor. The balance of the air war shifted in a matter of hours. The impregnable fortress of Europe was breached. The German High Command realized their technological pride was a fatal weakness. The radar they relied on to protect their cities was easily manipulated by trash. The skies over the Third Reich were no longer safe. The era of the invincible night fighter was over. The era of electronic warfare had begun. The sun rose over the burning ruins of Hamburg, but inside the concrete bunkers of the Kammhuber Line, the true nightmare was just beginning. German commanders stared at the lifeless radar screens. The electronic blizzard had settled down to the earth. The skies were clear. But the psychological armor of the Third Reich was shattered. They had built an impenetrable fortress of radio waves, and it collapsed overnight. Search teams scrambled across the countryside. They expected to find the shattered wreckage of hundreds of British heavy bombers. Instead, they found fields covered in trash. Millions of thin strips of black paper and aluminum foil littered the grass. They hung from the branches of trees. They coated the roofs of farmhouses. The elite investigators picked up the lightweight material. They stared at the cheap metal in disbelief. The bizarre evidence was rushed to Berlin. The highest-ranking generals of the Luftwaffe gathered around the briefing tables. They demanded an explanation for the catastrophic failure of their defense grid. The lead scientists placed the simple strips of foil on the polished wood. They explained the physics of the disaster. The exact cut of the metal mirrored the exact frequency of their multi-million-mark Würzburg radars. The room fell into a dead silence. The sheer humiliation was crushing. The most technologically advanced military machine on the planet was brought to its knees by kitchen foil. The arrogant Nazi leadership had spent years boasting about the supremacy of German engineering. They built towering flak installations. They designed the fastest night fighters in the world. But all of that heavy steel was rendered blind and useless by a weapon that cost pennies to manufacture. Panic ignited within the scientific ranks. Hermann Göring ordered an immediate solution. The survival of the German war economy depended on it. Top engineers worked around the clock in guarded laboratories. They tried to modify the radar frequencies. They attempted to filter out the static interference of the descending foil. But the British had anticipated this panic. Every time the Germans adjusted their dials, the RAF dropped different lengths of metal. The invisible war escalated into a desperate cat-and-mouse game. The skies over Europe became a contested electronic battlefield. The Germans developed new radars. The British built better jammers. But the initial shockwave of the window deception could never be undone. The illusion shattered the myth of the invincible night defense. The Luftwaffe interceptors could no longer trust their own instruments. Paranoia infected the elite squadrons. German pilots climbed into their cockpits with a new dread. The glowing green screens in their Messerschmitts were no longer a guaranteed hunting tool. They stared at the monitors, wondering if the approaching blip was a lethal Lancaster bomber, or just a handful of floating trash. The hesitation was fatal. A split second of doubt in the pitch-black air meant death. The hunters lost their edge. The great electronic wall was breached. The RAF Bomber Command held the supreme advantage. The skies belonged to the deceivers. The devastating raids multiplied in scale and destruction. The simple brown paper packages continued to rain down on the Reich, paving the way for the total collapse of the German industrial heartland. The era of the Phantom Fleet had claimed the night. The success over Hamburg was just the beginning. The British High Command realized the true potential of the aluminum foil. It was no longer just a shield to protect heavy bombers. It became an offensive weapon of mass deception. If dropping scrap metal could simulate a Phantom bomber fleet, what else could it simulate? The minds of the military planners turned toward the English Channel. The invasion of Europe was looming. The fortified Atlantic Wall stretched across the coast of France. Thousands of German radar stations watched the sea, waiting for the inevitable Allied invasion. To breach this coastal fortress, the element of surprise was the only hope. The Allies needed to land in Normandy, but they needed the German High Command to look the other way. They needed a Phantom invasion fleet. The plan was a masterpiece of electronic warfare, codenamed Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer. On the night before D-Day, a small group of specially trained Lancaster crews took off. They did not carry blockbuster bombs. They carried massive bundles of window. Their mission was to fly in tight, endless circles over the English Channel, pushing the aluminum strips out into the freezing wind at exact intervals. The physics of the deception required precise execution. The bombers flew in a slow, creeping formation heading toward the Pas de Calais, miles away from the actual Normandy beaches. As the metallic confetti fell toward the water, it created a massive radar signature. To the German operators watching their screens on the French coast, this did not look like aircraft. It looked exactly like an enormous convoy of approaching ships. Down in the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, the alarm sirens wailed. The German radar technicians stared at the creeping white wall on their monitors. The electronic blips were massive. They moved at the exact speed of heavy naval cruisers and troop transports. The German commanders took the bait. They scrambled their coastal defenses. They aimed their heavy artillery out into the pitch-black ocean, waiting for an enemy that did not exist, to seal the illusion. The Royal Navy added physical props to the electronic ghost. A handful of small patrol boats sailed directly beneath the falling foil. They dragged massive balloons filled with radar-reflecting wire. They broadcast fake radio chatter into the night. The combination of the falling window and the naval decoys created an inescapable trap. The German intelligence network was blinded by a symphony of scrap metal and noise. The deception held the line. The German High Command focused their attention on the Pas de Calais. They held their elite panzer divisions in reserve, refusing to send them south to Normandy. They believed the real invasion was arriving right in front of their fake radar contacts. The Ghost Fleet anchored the German army in place, while the real Allied armada quietly crossed the Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy. The strips of black paper and aluminum foil changed the course of the war. Again, the cheap invention that saved the bomber crews over Hamburg had just saved the D-Day landings. Thousands of Allied soldiers survived the bloody beaches because the German reinforcements were chasing shadows. The master of the sky was no longer the nation with the biggest guns. It was the nation that controlled the invisible spectrum. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, the battlefields of Europe were covered in broken steel and ash. But the most decisive weapon of the air war left almost no physical trace. The millions of aluminum strips rotted away in the soil. The simple brown paper dissolved in the rain. Yet this cheap, disposable trash broke the spine of the German night defense. It shattered the illusion of technological supremacy. The night the Würzburg radar went blind, warfare changed forever. The commanders of the world learned a terrifying lesson. Massive cannons and thick armor plating were no longer enough to win. The front line was no longer just a physical trench or a contested airspace. The front line expanded into the invisible spectrum. The era of electronic warfare was born in the cold skies over Hamburg. Fast forward to the battlefields of today. The year is 2026. The bombers are stealthy. The missiles are hypersonic. The skies swarm with autonomous drones. But the fundamental rule of combat remains exactly the same. If you can blind the sensors of your enemy, you win. The glowing green screens of 1943 have been replaced by digital networks. But the vulnerability is identical. Look at modern fighter jets dodging guided missiles. When a radar lock targets a multi-million-dollar aircraft, the pilot relies on the exact same principle. The jet ejects bursts of modern chaff. Clouds of radar-reflecting fibers bloom in the air, creating a phantom target to confuse the incoming threat. The ghost of the British Window Project still flies in every modern air force on the planet. The tactics have evolved into the digital realm. Military hackers spoof GPS coordinates. They broadcast fake signals to disorient drone swarms. They feed false data into the defense grids of entire nations. Creating phantom armies and ghost fleets with lines of code, it is the modern equivalent of pushing bundles of aluminum foil down a metal chute. The weapon is different. The deception is the same. The story of Window is a timeless warning to military empires. It proves that massive defense budgets and state-of-the-art engineering have a fatal blind spot. Superior firepower means nothing if you cannot see the target. Human ingenuity, tactical creativity, and the willingness to use simple solutions will always threaten complex systems. David did not beat Goliath with a bigger sword. He used a simple rock. The young boys in the Lancaster bombers did not understand the physics. They just followed orders. They tore open the packages and hurled the scrap metal into the freezing slipstream, trusting a handful of trash to shield them from the deadliest anti-aircraft network on Earth. Their courage, combined with the brilliant simplicity of the scientists, rewrote the rules of aerial combat. They turned the hunters into the hunted. So, look at the mechanized wars raging across the globe today. A massive question remains for you to answer in the comments below. Do you think modern electronic warfare and cyber attacks are more critical than traditional firepower? Or will raw physical destruction always decide the winner? Drop your thoughts down below. Hit that subscribe button to join our relentless pursuit of military history. I will see you in the next dark chapter of human conflict.